Hello and welcome to episode 228 of the 21st Century Work-Life podcast and the fourth in our series Connection and Disconnection in Remote Teams. And today's episode looks at, whose responsibility is it to make sure that our team members are not disconnected, that they don't start to drift into loneliness? So lot of really interesting and diverse points of view from a range of guests, some of whom you will have heard from before and some of whom actually some new ones. So great. But what is constant is Bri Kajati, who is the host of this series. Now, if you're joining us for the first time, welcome to the 21st Century Work-Life podcast, which is a show about leading remote teams, online collaboration, and how distributed organizations are evolving. And the company behind this podcast is Virtual Not Distant. I'm its director, Pilar Orti. Lovely to meet you if we haven't met before. We exist to help managers and their teams transition to an office optional approach to incorporate online collaboration and remote work practices. And you can find everything about us over at virtualnotdistant.com. And you can also send feedback through there. And the episode you're listening, it's the fourth now of a 7-episode series, which is being created in collaboration with ShieldGEO, who are a distributed company that, they help organizations employ people internationally by looking after tax, payroll, and essentially what they do is they simplify the process of having an employee in a different country. So indeed, Bri Kajati is driving this series. So I'm going to share a little bit of feedback before I pass you on to her and today's guests. And these are some thoughts actually from Tim Burgess, who is the person who had the idea of collaborating together on a series of episodes. And he said, "One thing I am finding interesting is self-reflection and self-awareness is becoming a real theme. It's kind of a chicken and egg problem. Loneliness is experienced primarily in the individual, and the individual is best placed to know what is happening for them. I don't like the idea of putting too much responsibility on the individual to monitor or even fix themselves. But as external contributors, like an employer whose workers are geographically isolated, perhaps the most effective thing we can do is encourage self-reflection in the individual." And those words, particularly on the 22nd of March, 2020, that I'm recording this intro, I think those words resonate even more now. I think that is a really thoughtful strategy that will help individuals get what they need and start thinking about what they need and reach out with what they need most. So thank you very much, Tim. I do always enjoy conversations with Tim. I'm learning so much about him. It's a plus of hosting a series for the podcast. So I do encourage you, if you haven't listened to previous episodes of this series, you'll get more from it today. Otherwise, just enjoy. This theme of connection and disconnection starts to spill into the wider well-being aspect. So we can see how everything is connected and we like to look at things as a whole here. As I said, you will hear from some new guests and from some that you have already heard before. So again, I love that Bri is bringing new voices to the show, as well as bringing back those that I like and love. So thank you very much. I think I'm particularly emotional today. So anyway, that's enough from me. I will leave you now with Bri Kajati, who is driving this series. I'll leave you in her very capable hands, and I will pop in at the end of the episode to remind you how you can get in touch.
Hi everyone, welcome back to another episode of Connection and Disconnection in Remote Teams. Thanks so much for joining me again as we continue to unpack this really hearty topic. As always, I'm your host, Bri Kajati, and I'm taking us through this mini-series on behalf of ShieldGEO in collaboration with Virtual Not Distant. Now, as Pilar mentioned, we've been getting some really amazing responses from listeners, so I just wanted to personally thank you for being really engaged and vocal as we go through this subject together. It's really encouraging to know that just how much this is resonating within our remote work community, and I hope that this can be a resource of sorts to start lots more conversations within this space. This is the 4th episode in our short series, so if you haven't listened back to those first few episodes, I encourage you to do that. Otherwise, let's get stuck into this week's topic. Today we're looking at where the responsibility lies when dealing with connection within remote teams. Should organisations and employers do all the work in ensuring their teams feel connected, or is it up to the employee to self-monitor and seek out connection points outside of their work? As always, we'll be hearing from a range of voices on this and looking at the many sides to this question. But firstly, we're hearing from Laurel Farah, and she helps to define what the breakdown of roles within a company looks like to give us a jumping off point. Here she is.
So if we define work as identifying a problem and developing a solution, then we can define management as overseeing that production, right? And ensuring that result is produced. So when we go offsite and we work remotely as an individual, this circles back to the self-management conversation, right? So we are working independently and we are only focused on work as we know it. So as in tasks, assignments, and tangible responsibilities, deliverables. And so we only think that we need to be focused on identifying the problems and providing a solution as it relates to our tangible tasks.
So in other words, at the most basic level, I think we can all agree that it's the employee's responsibility to complete the work that they've been hired to do, and it's the manager's responsibility to manage that overall workflow. But I think we also know that the work experience is a lot more than just getting that work done. And the particulars of what this looks like in a remote position is what we really want to be talking about in this episode.
However, employee experience and work experience is so much more comprehensive than just the deliverables that you are producing. It has to do with your energy levels, your focus, your career development, all aspects of you and your work life also need to be managed in addition to your tasks and assignments. And so we see a dangerous level of career stagnancy in freelancers specifically because they don't have that person, that leadership that is overseeing their work life in general. So are you taking enough breaks? Are you saving for retirement? Are you having a personal development evaluation once a year? Are you getting raises? Are you taking education courses that will help you progress in your career? All of that stuff is the benefit of working with a company and having a leader and a manager that can provide that perspective for you in your life. So yes, when you're isolated as a remote worker and specifically as a freelancer, when you're zeroed in only on that work, the tangible work, you're missing out on the rest of that self-management and your career and your personal life, sometimes your personal health is taking a hit because of that.
In our previous episodes, we've talked a lot about self-reflection practices, how these feelings of disconnection can creep up on us or change over time, and that makes it really difficult for us and those around us to pick up on these feelings. The solutions we've talked about so far have really focused on asking ourselves questions, discovering where we're feeling, and recognizing our own limits. And while we still agree with all of this, I think Laurel's example of the struggles of freelancers compared to those in more structured company positions really shows us how significant managers can be in employees' overall career experience. This issue is nuanced, there are many players at hand, and as with everything, there isn't a one-size-fits-all. Teresa Douglas explains this really well.
So I as a worker can do many things to feel connected to my colleagues, to my direct reports, to my boss. I can do things outside of work so that I have that support structure. Pick up a hobby, go to the meetings of that hobby, get outside, do something. But if my boss is someone I don't trust, or I'm in a meeting and nobody asks my opinion of something, or I never get a moment to talk, that is a company issue. So I feel like that question is nuanced. It's also on a sliding scale of where the problem is and how we need to combat it.
The problem of disconnection in remote teams can lie in a few different camps at once. which is why I think there's such a difficulty in pinning this responsibility on just one group. If a person has chosen not to leave their house in weeks and subsequently not seen another human, it's pretty obvious that there's some responsibility there for them to change those habits. But what if they never received education or training, or simply even had conversations with their remote employers around how to stay safe while working from home? There could definitely be arguments made that this is a barrier for them to make connections, and even more if during the workday there's limited regular contact. Tim Burgess argues that when you create a distributed company in the first place, that there is a duty of care to make sure that your employees are safe enough to do their jobs, and this includes safeguarding them against isolation.
Yeah, I think as an employer, when we're hiring people, we're hiring them into a circumstance that we create, not them. And so if we're hiring somebody in a situation where they're not going to have colleagues sitting next to them, they might not even have colleagues in their own time zone, we do bear responsibility for that. And it is our responsibility to acknowledge that we're putting someone in that situation. In the same way that if we were hiring somebody and we wanted them to work 80 hours a week, we have responsibility for what toll that would take upon them as a person. So I think it is important to have intentionality around it.
Julianne Holt-Lundstedt agrees, saying that even though there will always be some personal choice involved, it's impossible to ignore the barriers that certain environments will have on our ability to make these decisions or change our behavior in some way.
We have personal responsibility, but when there are factors in the environment that systematically put people in situations that increase potential risk, whether those are policies that are in place or practices that are in place, or the way our physical environment creates barriers that make it more difficult. So for instance, I'm living in Utah right now, but I did my sabbatical in the Netherlands. And when I lived in the Netherlands, I rode my bike every single day. And it was very easy because the environment was up for it. There were bike trails everywhere. And I felt very safe because the paths were separated from the cars. And then I come back to Utah and I am bound and determined to do the same thing. But my physical environment makes it much more difficult. I don't have designated bike lanes, and so it would mean going in traffic. And there are massive mountains and hills that make biking much more harder. And if we can think about our environment when it comes to social kinds of things, if our surroundings make it challenging for us to spend time with other people, we have to think about how do we overcome those barriers? I think it's really useful to then think about the different ways in which some of these systematic practices or policies, or even just how our physical environment is set up, that then in turn influences those individual choices.
This example goes to show that we really can't just fall into remote work, that the way in which we set up our companies, the policies and initiatives that we put in place, all actually really matter. Laura's been speaking about this for years, and in fact, this was one of the main motivators for her to set up her company, Distribute Consulting.
Remote work is becoming more common, and so people are adopting it more freely, and therefore we do see these cultures much more often, meaning remote-friendly cultures and healthy hybrid teams. However, the number of companies that are doing it correctly, with a vision of compliance and a vision of sustainability, those are almost non-existent. Most people are going into this change completely organically, and it's incorrectly assuming that just sending somebody away from the office makes them a remote worker. And that's exactly why we see the informational isolation, the social isolation. That's why we also see discrimination. That's why we see career stagnancy, because they're not intentionally making this change and building the infrastructure to support it. So yes, companies like mine, consultants, really, really help that and say, okay, how do we go about this change in a responsible way? What are the pitfalls of remote work that you need to prevent? And how do you do this legally and sustainably so that it can be a healthy developmental strategy for your company as opposed to just a workplace change.
It's here that I start to think about duty of care and the implications of what it means to hire someone remotely without setting them up for success and sustainability. I spoke with Isabel Collins, the founder of Belonging Space, a consulting firm that helps to foster that sense of belonging within a workplace.
My personal take is, yes, I think there is a duty of care. I think it's very important that there is a duty of care, in the same way as there's a duty of care for well-being and safety if you are working in a heavy engineering environment that's obviously high risk. There's the same duty of care because you see that there is that risk. I think there could be a very strong argument if somebody felt they had not been supported and had gone into quite a bad time of it with, feeling depressed or feeling, really feeling sort of the darkness of isolation, and their manager had not supported them or had not responded. I would imagine that would make quite an interesting legal case. I don't know the legalities of it. From an organisational and from a moral standpoint, yes, I think there is absolutely a duty of care. And it also just that common sense, just that good commercial sense means that that's the way it should go.
From my own research, duty of care is defined as a legal obligation where an individual is required to offer a standard of reasonable care while performing any acts that could foreseeably harm others. It's what drives our health and safety practices in the workplace, but also in public spaces and establishments like restaurants or venues or theme parks. It's the first element that must be established to proceed with an action in negligence. Tara Vastani, the principal lawyer at Remote Law Canada, shared her insight from an Ontario perspective, which is where her firm is based.
So duty of care, the way that it's defined legally in Ontario is probably a little bit different than globally. There are two perspectives. So duty of care relates to the proximity between two individuals or an individual in a corporation, pretty much two parties, and figuring out that proximity to determine if it's close enough that there's a cause and effect relationship. So that's duty of care from a negligence or a liability perspective. When you're thinking about caring for your remote employees or your remote workforce, really what it turns into is the wellness of your employees as a whole. So some of the things that come up when you think of duty of care is, for example, the physical benefits that come with, standard benefit packages such as health and dental, but also a lot of the mental health benefits or psychological benefits that you need to continue to provide to your remote employees to avoid, frankly, liability. So employers have a duty to create a safe workplace and to maintain a safe and healthy workplace. And that's one of the greatest hurdles we're dealing with right now with companies that are not remote. But that is a duty that extends whether the employee is in office or at home. And sometimes the lines tend to be blurred between when the employee requires that safety and that health obligation when they are at home, because employers tend to think, well, they're in their own space, they don't need to be cared for. And it's a misconception, and it frankly shouldn't happen. And one thing that I encourage employers that are operating this infrastructure to recall is that, for example, in Ontario, under the Human Rights Code, employers are not permitted to discriminate based on disability. Mental and physical disabilities are treated the same in Ontario, and therefore you can very well have an employee that has been neglected or not cared for that all of a sudden is suffering from depression or anxiety or other mental health related symptoms, and you could very quickly be facing a lawsuit for discriminating against them by not accommodating them or ensuring that you are minimizing some of the conditions they're suffering from to the greatest extent possible.
And it might help to inform us and encourage us to treat isolation in remote work not as an inevitable byproduct, but something that can actually be mitigated by careful planning and assessment. But of course, it's never really that simple, is it? All the careful planning in the world won't matter if an individual isn't willing to participate.
But belonging really is multi-way. It's not about command and control top down. So although there is the responsibility for duty of care, you can't tell someone to belong. And that becomes a whole different interpretation of the word, doesn't it? That becomes ownership. That's treating your employees as your belongings, which they're not. Belonging should be a positive act of being part of something. So therefore, I suppose the responsibility does sit also with the individual. So I think the responsibility sits with the individual to take care, to have a care, and to share when they need care.
We learnt in the previous episodes how hard it is to recognise when someone's struggling and how this can be amplified when we can't see them face to face. By nature, this means that there has to be some responsibility on the individual to speak up. But for Marcus Vermuth, even this is tied up in the manager's role of creating a safe space for these kinds of conversations to occur.
There's also responsibility for the others or the other individuals to kind of try and share or bring it up if they can. But ultimately, that comes back to, is the culture, is it safe? Is it psychologically safe that people will bring those things up? So yeah, it's probably a lot of responsibility on us and maybe just a short amount for the individual team members.
But what does creating a safe space actually look like?
There's no one solution. We're all humans, we're all different, and every company operates differently. There's maybe certain themes that go in the same direction. You probably could tell as you talk to a lot of people about this, but one thing I always come back to is, as you said, the self-reflection part that we can just educate everyone on, but also the openness and maybe authenticity in a team, like that psychological safety. It's a big loaded topic, I know, but a lot comes down to, being open and creating this safe space for people to talk about things. I see a lot in the expression of leading by example. So me sharing, I go to therapy. Our CEO shared an article about his burnout issue that he had. So leading by example does a lot.
We know by now that so much of culture and behaviour is picked up almost incidentally. So it doesn't matter if in meetings you're saying, okay, company, we really want open communication, we think it's really good. If you're feeling isolated, you have to let us know. If they're not able to see this value playing out elsewhere or demonstrated in the leadership, it's unlikely it'll be picked up, even if you all agree that logically it's the right thing to do.
So Buffer gives a great culture, which gives us a great foundation to do more of this. Then, of course, you yourself have to be vulnerable. That's something you have to work on yourself. And then, of course, I would say also my manager, Katie, the VP, definitely, again, even up to the CEO, the leadership by example, the authenticity that helped me in kind of tapping more into this. So I think it's a mix of all three of those things, whereas Buffer is a great foundation, the VP, the CEO, it's a great example. And then, of course, you have to do the heavy lifting yourself, to reflect on yourself, to understand more about yourself, and to actually do then those calls or do those chats that might be a bit more tricky.
In the same way that there needs to be support from managers to facilitate employees' self-reflective practices and open communication, I also think it's fair to say that there needs to be adequate training and support for managers too. Maybe feedback and guidance on particular styles of management that lend themselves to remote teams, or even company-wide policy and structure to fall back on, such as implementing one-on-one chats or the kinds of questions that might be helpful to ask. These kinds of frameworks on both the manager and employee level provide a kind of bumper network or safety net. Within the confines of these policies, managers and their teams can go through trial and error safely to find the particulars of what works for them. So for instance, if the policy is that you need to meet once a week, but this week you've tried to do that while Skyping at a local coffee shop or on a walk, but it didn't necessarily go to plan because the Wi-Fi dropped out, this isn't the end of the world because you know you'll meet again next week. It can also give clear boundaries of where the responsibilities begin and end in circumstances that might escalate.
I think there needs to be a line where managers then say, okay, listen, I can help you until here, but then you should maybe either see someone or chat to your family or your friends to figure this out more, or maybe self-reflect more on it, because I don't know every one of your family members. I don't know your spouse or your partner, and I can't help you with that. So I think there's a line where our profession ends and another one starts. At Buffer, we do have something in the middle, I would say, although I don't know the experiences with it. I tried it once, called Joyable, where it's kind of it's called cognitive behavioral therapy. So you can sign up and get paired with a trainer or a therapist for 15 or 20 minutes, and you can get a regular schedule to talk about maybe anxiety feelings or maybe even isolation. And this could be, if your company has something like that, a good way to point them to that resource, because ultimately you can't, like, there's a point where you can't help that person anymore. You can help them discover it, but you can't fix it all, if that makes sense.
At this point, it's become fairly obvious that investing in connection within remote teams has a load of benefits for everyone involved. It can help ward off some of those potentially really serious impacts that we talked about in the last episode, including health concerns, economic stress, and of course team dynamics and productivity too. I spoke to Courtney Sader, Director of People and Culture at Buffer, to get her thoughts on this.
It just makes so much sense from a business point of view that you would want to make sure that the people who are creating your products or, creating the experience or whatever it is you make or produce are doing okay and are able to kind of keep doing their work in a way that feels sustainable. We talk a lot about burnout at Buffer because it's a very real part of the sort of tech ecosystem right now. Folks, will work nights and weekends to launch something, and then they're so exhausted and so burnt out that it's hard to get back into any sort of sustainable work pattern when you're working yourself that way. So just from a strictly business point of view, your people are what makes things happen for your company. So if you don't take care of them, your long-term success is very much in peril. So even not even thinking about the right thing to do from a strict bottom line point of view, I think it makes so much sense to try and take care of your people as your mechanism for having a company at all, for making things happen within your company. Now, Buffer also focuses on, what is the right thing to do? What is the ethical thing to do? And for us, that's made it very obvious that focusing on the teammate experience is going to be really important. We want folks to be able to stay with us for as long as they are interested. We want folks to always keep growing and always feel like they've got a great work-life blend, that they're able to take care of their families and have, fulfilling hobbies and side businesses if they want. Life should be really full of stuff besides work, and we really want to keep that central. So it is really important to us from the ethical right thing to do point of view to make sure we're taking care of our teammates, and that takes the form of casual video chat conversations that we hold fairly regularly, all the way to paying for a co-working space if folks want to get out of the office that way, paying for coffee if you want to go work from a coffee shop once in a while. It's almost like you have to put these stopgaps into place, because you can get tunnel vision as a remote worker. You can end up staying in your house for days on end. And it's hard to break out of that. Once you're in that pattern, it's hard to realize you are in a bad spot and break yourself out of it. You almost sometimes need that outside help to make that happen.
When we talk about responsibility, it can sometimes come across as someone having to take on extra work. And in the context of this series, I wouldn't blame you for thinking along those lines. Of all the benefits that remote work brings to our lives, it seems like this issue of connection just takes a little bit more effort. But interestingly, disconnection can and is happening everywhere. Within co-located companies, schools, universities, and relationships. This isn't solely a remote work issue at all, but I do think we might be in a unique position to address it. Within our community first, but potentially with flow-on effects elsewhere too. Pila shared a really interesting experience she had that showcases how the technology and practices remote workers utilize actually has the power to connect us and even take away some of that burden of the extra intention.
I remember I used to teach in a drama school. I was teaching 6 hours a week only. And so I'd come in, I'd do my stuff, and then I'd go back. And sometimes I'd turn up to find out that my class had been cancelled. And nobody had told me. And of course, this is probably stuff that was circulated via pigeonholes or word of mouth, or something that had been decided the day before or something. So it was really, you've mentioned, and some of another guest of yours, Laurel, she mentions, she's talked before about information isolation. And that, not having access to that, made me feel very disconnected from them. Because no one had thought, oh, we better tell Pilar because she has a class tomorrow. And luckily I was only a 10-minute walk from my house. But still, it's that feeling that that you're not in anyone's thoughts. If you can imagine, like, the 21st century equivalent of the story I told you would probably be that someone went and said, hey, everyone, tomorrow there's not going to be a class. And then they don't have to think if Pilar is coming in. They don't have to think of who else, because they can put it somewhere, and then everyone has a responsibility to check and be involved in those conversations. So I think that technology now allows us even to not have to think as much. In a way, this is a bit strange thing to say, not have to always have in mind who might need to know, because we've set a system up where those who need to know where to look for the information. It has lots of problems with it, etc. But I think in essence, that's it. And that is what allows me to feel like I am part of that team, that I am connected to those people, is that I have access to information about the work that might not be directly connected sometimes to what I need, but that's how I connect, by seeing that information.
I think that was interesting that you sort of said that it might not even be directly related to you, but it still makes you feel like you're part of that team, because you're sort of absorbing that communication between people that, you can read through and be like, okay, this isn't to do with me, but you have a sort of sense of what everybody else is doing, what's going through their days and minds and things like that as well, which I think we maybe take a little bit for granted when we're in an office situation with that sort of just background awareness of the team. Whereas when you're sort of just communicating with the people that you need to communicate to get your job done, you don't really have that awareness of the rest of the team and what might be happening for them.
Yeah. And also you don't only sometimes get data from those conversations. Sometimes you get some information about the person also. So sometimes you might see how someone has phrased something, and what they're saying is not important, but actually you go, oh, look, they used that word, or, oh, they made that reference, or, oh, that really annoyed them. So it's also a little bit of a window. But these modes of having conversations in the open, of deliberately sharing what you're thinking instead of not, means that people have access to your thoughts, that people have access to your conversation. So more specifically, I do like places like Slack when they have rules around them, and also remembering that these places can be used as an asynchronous check when you want to check them, rather than I ping you all the time and expect you to reply immediately.
Unfortunately, we seem to be setting up these rules of communication really late in the game. This may be because most of our organizations are growing organically, and the needs of a 2-person team are drastically different to one that's made up of 100 or 200 or 300 people. So developing rules around communication might not even be on our radar until we start running into problems. It could also be that our initial set of guidelines are no longer working for us, whether that be because the organization has changed over time, or maybe it wasn't even a good fit to begin with. And while we would always encourage implementing deliberate guidelines around how you're going to work remotely as early as possible, these examples go to show that there also needs to be room to adjust and evolve over time.
We have been using this tool for a while. And guess why this conversation started? Somebody said, I think we're not using this right, and can't we do something to do this? So it is very, very common. And I think that is something either at a practical level, because organizations say, okay, now we're using this and now you've got it. And no one has time, in inverted commas, to look at it. But then that's okay. So like you say, there's a problem, let's readjust, but let's really step back then. And let's go back, and instead of saying, oh, how do we use this or whatever, you could go, okay, what do we need? What kind of communication do we need? What kind of information do we need from each other? And as always, we don't just mean data. We need loads of information about each other. Okay, where are the best places to address this? And it doesn't always have to be asynchronous communication, of course. So what are the best places in which we address these different kinds of communication? So, for example, what do we need to know? We need to know who's doing what. Okay, that's one thing. We need to know, I need a safe space to discuss things. Okay, that's a certain kind of thing. I need to know where people are, because that's important for me. Okay, so being really specific about what each person needs can then help us to design that. And I think you can just about now design between the different tools, the different mediums, and asynchronous and synchronous. I think you can design something where you don't lose anyone.
Pilar also makes the point to bring team members into these discussions to allow them to create their own guidelines, ones that will actually be beneficial to their individual needs. In this way, the responsibility is shared in a way that empowers each team member to make decisions that have a direct positive impact on how they experience their work.
You need rules to be able to play. So if you have a blank canvas, you're lost. You don't know where to start. You don't know who to play with. There's different ways of doing it. You can be very sensitive and understand what a team or an organization might need and see what norms are useful and formalize those, and then try and discourage some of the other behaviors. The other thing is that in formalizing what kind of conversations we have where, etc., I think it can reduce that sense of, I don't know where I am. And little very practical things like posting a message or reaching out to someone in one channel, in one mode of communication, and not getting a message because we haven't agreed that we're checking that regularly. That can really feel very isolating. And it can really, this is another layer, is that not using the technology well can do great damage to personal relationships. And going back a little bit to earlier, the concepts of working out loud, the concepts of visible teamwork are all about providing information about ourselves and our work that can help others, that can help us connect to others. It's not always practical help. Sometimes it's just, again, it's finding different points of connection and being very deliberate about doing that and knowing why we're doing it also. So I think that's for me personally, that's where I connect with people, when I see what they're working on, where I can read something they've done, or when I can see a task they've done. That is when I feel connected to them, as much as having a nice chat about something else.
There are no real clear-cut answers here. The proportion of responsibility is likely to look different company to company, but I don't think that should deter us from doing that really important work of discovery. We know that self-reflection is key, but we also know that setting up a company that has the ability to function remotely is necessary too. Systems can help provide structure, but every individual has different needs. And while this is all potentially really messy, I think the wrestling to work it out is incredibly worthwhile. In the next 2 episodes, we'll be hearing some more specific examples of what companies and individuals are implementing, trialing, and experiencing to hopefully give you some more ideas on what might actually work for your company. So I hope you can join us for that. This ends our episode for the day, and I just wanted to end by saying a massive thank you to all of the guests who've shared their expertise with me for this episode and the previous ones as well. I can't believe the depth of insight that we've been able to gather for this, so thank you so much for that. And of course, thank you to you listeners for joining us again, and I really hope that you enjoyed this episode and learned something new. We look forward to having you along for the rest of the series. We'll be back in 2 weeks. Talk soon.
Well, listeners, I hope this has provided plenty of food for thought, and we would love to hear your reflections and additions. I'm extremely grateful to ShieldGEO and, of course, Brie Kajati in particular for taking on this mammoth project. Do get in touch through virtualnotdistant.com, or if you want to email, you can do so at pilar@virtualnotdistant.com, and I will share your message with the team. Do let us know your thoughts on this huge topic of connection and disconnection in remote teams.